Evening, everybody. It's 6 o'clock, minute after, so we'll go ahead and get started since we have a short time this evening due to the Planning and Zoning Commission regular meeting agenda starting at 7. So tonight we are at the last meeting of the year, so we thought it would be a good time to recap everything we've been discussing, get any more thoughts and feedback and comments from you all, and then really spend some time talking about what our next steps are that we have planned going into the new year. So Matt Ashby is going to be leading our discussion tonight from the consultant team. So with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Matt for PowerPoint presentation, and then we'll jump into question answer discussion time. So thanks.
All right, thanks Wade for the introduction there. So today we really want to just make sure a couple of things. We want to go over what we heard from you essentially and to make sure that we captured it correctly, and what that will do is give us a foundation to basically move into the next step, which is really broadening our net and gathering a little bit more specific feedback from the broader community. And so tonight, again, with respect to the Planning Commission hearing kicking off in an hour, we do want to try and keep this pretty tight as far as the conversation goes. And the second half of tonight's discussion will be a preview of that public engagement, as well as a little bit more in-depth, some Q&A, hopefully discussion on how to best engage the community as we move towards our next workshops after the first of the year. So with that, again, just a quick recap. We did a kickoff September 8th, talked about walkability and parking, as well as walkability and street design, sustainability in November, along with housing and neighborhood character. And then tonight we're looking at a recap of issues, and then looking towards public engagement, really targeted through a January to April or even into summer timeframe, just depending on how those conversations go. And ultimately, really starting to dive into drafting code on some of the things that are maybe a little bit clearer here sooner rather than later. And then for some of those items that we need additional discussion on, we'll start drafting those closer to the summer and into fall timeframe. So that's generally where we are as far as the project status goes. So you're gonna see us presenting a little bit of information. First, what do our plans say about each topic? We'll also then do a review of what our codes say. And I'm gonna kind of keep these pretty brief just in respect of time, but really try and focus on making sure we heard you right in terms of the things that the steering committee really discussed. So as far as parking and walkability, our plans are really looking at more walkable, transit-oriented centers, encouraging less dependency on autos, really looking at connectivity for neighborhood revitalization, and a number of different things that are location specific or context specific as far as parking regulations and things like that. So the development code currently has identified, really it's a pretty typical suburban car-oriented code. There is some flexibility provided through the PUD process and parking agreements, with some exceptions for the Broadway corridor. Also, ability for bike parking to be required, but it doesn't necessarily reduce the required amount of vehicle parking, and that there are some neighborhood permits for street parking in some of those busier districts. So in summary, generally what we heard from the steering commission or steering committee discussion is that you're looking for optimal parking, not too much, not too little, looking for an increase in a multimodal future. So acknowledging that some changes are coming. It may not happen tomorrow or in a year or two from now, but just making sure that we're prepared within our development code is key. Additionally, looking at different context-based solutions. So, not a one size fits all, but really looking at opportunities to provide flexibility. The next point that we heard from you was really looking at mitigating impacts on the community environment, on streetscapes, and those types of adjacent property issues. Looking at coordinating parking. So it isn't necessarily all about regulation, but it's broader transportation policies, blending with public and private investments that shape the parking situation, as well as flexibility, to accommodate options, but don't force change if we're not ready for it. So those are the items that we heard from you on parking. And we just wanted to take this time to make sure that we didn't miss any really big ideas that you want to bring to the forefront. And so this is kind of the model we'll use for the next couple of summaries. So at this point, I would go ahead and throw it open to the committee to either clarify or identify any big items that we might be missing on this list.
And this is Brooke talking. I'm with Community Development, Brooke Bell, and I would just add to what Matt said. If any, I know everyone couldn't make every session, but if anybody missed the sessions or a session or wanted to chime in and add to this, this would be the perfect time. So. Yeah, we're talking about walkability and parking. And so if anybody, this will not be the last chance. Certainly, we're going to continue to discuss these topics, but if you wanted to throw anything in there now with what Matt has talked about, that'd be great timing. So anything? Okay. Sorry, I interrupted. Go ahead, Matt.
Thanks, Brooke. And folks, if you do have something that comes to mind, just go ahead and use the raise hand feature on the Zoom, and we'll get back to these issues if you want to circle back. So, okay. Oh, well, and I'm sorry, I forgot my next slide with some of the options. So some of the options that we'll be looking at as far as our upcoming discussions include examination of reducing the minimum requirements for parking, looking at the idea of implementing maximums. So really trying to identify, how much parking is maybe too much parking as part of our future discussions on the code. Looking at expanding specified exemptions. So are there specific items where we would want parking reduced or exempted from requirements based on either shared use or specific adjacencies maybe? Streamlining shared parking as an option. That can be sometimes a complicated thing to juggle, but if we can streamline that process, that means more efficient land use for parking. Additionally, looking at promoting more transportation demand management. So looking at reductions for alternate transportation plans and considering different timing demands that might be present. Also looking at increased administrative flexibility. So this would be things like parking credits or context-specific reductions that could be made without having to maybe go through a variance process or things like that. And then the last point is really looking at the improved design of parking so that it blends in better and maybe transitions better to different neighborhoods and between land uses. So on the right-hand side of the slide, we're really kind of setting up this idea of a spectrum of how to address parking issues. And again, you'll see this in the rest of the topics that we outline. Are we looking at significant change, moderate change? Are we just looking to improve the status quo? So these are the types of questions that we'll be asking at the next to the public as we dive deeper into these topics. So I'm going to go ahead and pause there again and just make sure that this is generally on the right track. And if anybody has any questions.
We do have a couple of raised hands, Colin and then Christine.
I appreciate the summary here, and I don't know if it's necessarily specifically something that we're looking at here from your list, but one thing that I had meant to bring up earlier was not necessarily minimum parking, but minimum dimensions or anything like that. Is that something that we are going to put in or is already in or might be adjusted? Because it feels like in some parking lots, it's almost harder to park because the parking is too narrow, too small, and then you end up with people taking two spots and it ends up, you know, wasting basically spaces. And then I think in some of these new developments also, their garages maybe aren't big enough to have a vehicle or anything in reality with what today's SUVs and things like that are. So I'm not sure if those items are in here, but it would be good if we could include that as part of the parking.
Very good. Yes, and I'll defer to Wade on kind of what current standards require, but generally development codes do have minimum widths and depths, as well as spacing requirements for drive aisles. So those all will be examined and included in the development code. And I think the idea of the minimum garage size, you know, I don't know, Wade, that I've ever seen that specified in terms of a development code, but that may be something for us to consider.
Yeah, no, I don't know that I've ever seen minimum size for garages either. But yeah, that is something that's be interesting to look into
on the list.
Yeah, and then, you know, our standards now, typical parking spaces, 9 by 18. Travel aisle widths vary if it's one way or two way, and then whether or not you have 90-degree parking or angled parking. You know, two-way travel aisles, 24 feet. You can sometimes get down to 20 feet if you're a one-way route for vehicles. So we do have standards in there for those sorts of things now. You know, I don't know, sometimes with PUDs or alternative parking plans, you know, those dimensions get squished a little bit for the ability to maybe add a few more spaces, or if you're planning compact vehicle parking or motorcycle vehicle spaces, things can get squished a little bit, just depending on specific circumstances. And that's why they would go through the alternative parking plan review with us and with Public Works in order to justify any kind of changes or reductions.
Would we see those, Wade, if those came through? Would that just be with your department and
you'd see them with a planned unit development?
Yeah.
But if it's a by right project, it would just be administratively through staff review of those.
Okay. Thanks.
Christine?
Thanks, good points and great summary so far. I would like if one of the options could be EV ready requirements, at least for commercial and multifamily new developments.
Very good. I can't recall. I know we talked about that under the sustainability as well. So we may see it show up there, but I will make sure it's on the list.
Great.
Kate Townley?
Thanks. Maybe this goes under landscaping requirements, but I'm wondering if we can add any considerations for permeability that goes along with parking, just for future stormwater and water quality, because they're usually very paved sites. I think the other thing is thinking about the possibility, especially with structured parking, and as we become more dense, just with the nature of being a landlocked city, and having more structured parking, just considerations for, I think some communities do requirements for the first or the ground level of structured parking, so it can be flexible and can be used as commercial space or other space in the future. That way, like the conditions that we have along Old Hampton right now, we have a lot of structured parking garages, and then there's no opportunity for adding any kind of retail or things like that along the street, and those are very expensive permanent structures. So I think if there's anything that we can do either with our code or somehow to add in some flexibility, or just think about future use of those types of spaces.
Very good. I got it noted. Great. I am not seeing any hands, and just in the interest of time, I do want to maybe go ahead and move on. Appreciate the comments. So as far as street design, again, a summary of our plans looks at increased and enhanced multimodal ability and accessibility for all residents, bike and ped considerations throughout the city, high quality aesthetics, presence of visibility for those bike and ped facilities, and promoting quality of life transportation philosophy. So really looking at that as a driver. The development codes, it is addressed in a number of different locations and references several other documents. So this is one where there's definitely an interplay between multiple regulatory areas, and really looking at a variety of current minimum standards, but they do not as well address urban design elements and kind of that context issue, which is an item that the steering committee has discussed. So really looking at better coordination between the development code and other street guidance standards, looking at our streets as active social spaces, and identifying opportunities for different streetscape elements in different contexts. So, some places might be more transit oriented with bus and bike facilities. Others might have opportunities for outdoor seating. Also looking at opportunities for protected bike lanes, and considering that topic was one of the things that you had discussed. And then looking at incremental and cost-effective strategies. So, how do you move forward knowing that you're not going to have a whole lot of brand new major road construction, but on a block by block basis, we need to have solutions as well. And then finally looking to make sure that all improvements are ADA compliant. And then some of the options that we'll be looking at include emphasizing the urban design elements of the streetscape, looking at different street types for different contexts. So, making sure that we're thinking about the function and the land use and how it relates to that public realm of the street. Additionally, looking at best practices for those infill and redevelopment scenarios, and looking at different ways to prioritize the city's investments so that the development can occur incrementally in a logical way. And finally, just hammering home that issue of specific contexts, really thinking through, how our streets relate to the adjacent land uses and the character of the neighborhoods that they impact. So looking at how the UDC on the right-hand side can impact street design, again, we've got a reactive approach that we could take, maybe a little bit less forward, and looking at requiring projects to improve right-of-way in association with the development approval. A proactive approach could be done that some of those right-of-way improvements are done with anticipation of development. And then maybe a more strategic approach could be that the UDC corresponds with some of the public city improvements and investment strategies. So these are some of the choices that we'll have ahead as we start to flesh out code requirements and approaches to walkability and street design. So any comments or questions or clarifications on street design?
Matt, I might add that it might be covered in this a little bit, but I think it would be a good thing to keep in mind to not only improve, right away and streetscapes, but also keep in mind you need to get people to your front door, not just to your site. So walkability, I think, can include internal site design as well.
Great.
Like I said, that may be covered in some of this already, but something to keep in mind.
Colin?
Yeah, kind of building on what Kate said too, if there's a way of including some sustainable features or water quality type things, maybe that'll be in another section, but something more with some of our streetscapes that would provide some of that benefit to our community would be great if we could include some of that in here as well.
Very good. Excellent. Any other comments? All right, very good. So moving on to sustainability, and we might pick up some of that clarity here in this section as well. So current plans, there's a number of different ones that talk about sustainability, really looking at the idea of expanding educational efforts and stewardship, looking at environmental quality as it relates to the transportation system. So again, some of those considerations that were just mentioned, looking at promoting recycling and adaptive reuse of waste materials and structures. And Kate, I think that maybe fits into the conversation that you were mentioning of those parking structures, really thinking about, do we have opportunities to make sure that we're not just building for a single use future, but really looking at that flexibility as we grow. The next item is promoting conservation of energy and improved air quality, water conservation, and then there are the 10 specific goals of the sustainability plan that we want to keep in mind as well. So currently the development code, the city is looking at updates to the building and energy codes, and that is a separate process. I think one of the challenges with sustainability is that these items can be housed in a variety of different areas of the regulatory environment. So I think that's one thing that we're going to need to be careful in navigating. the development code is somewhat neutral or silent on things like site-specific renewable facilities, wind turbines, things like that as an accessory use. Xeric or water efficient landscapes are currently only encouraged. Passive heating, as well as multimodal transportation items are somewhat silent in the current standards. So our discussion so far has been really, we had a great presentation from the chief building official that provided a lot of good ideas and outlines of how some of these items relate to the building code. So certainly looking at energy use as some options within that parallel process. Building performance and construction, again, looking at things that are really likely in the building code. Transportation habits, though, are really shaped by the development code and how we subdivide land and build streets and things like that. So really wanting to make sure that we're looking at those items. Water conservation is definitely something to look at in the development code as well. And then preservation, conservation, and mitigating impacts, things like stormwater best management practices. So things like were mentioned before of the permeable parking lots and things like that. Definitely part of this point. Dark sky lighting, tree protection. So a lot of items covered in the discussion from the steering committee already on sustainability. So some of the options to consider, again, looking at supporting those ongoing discussions within other codes. So making sure we get the right pieces in the right places as far as the codes go. Looking at energy use and the idea of landscaping providing sustainability in terms of energy. Looking at building performance and construction. So some of those concepts related to the parking and EV vehicles, I think fall under this, this discussion, as well as transportation and water conservation being key elements that we'll look at and discuss as we're crafting the regulations. So how should the UDC address those specific topics? Again, we'll be looking as we roll this out to a broader engagement is to try and get folks to give us an idea of how proactive do we want to be on certain elements. And maybe there's other elements that we're looking at either enabling at this point to build for a more sustainable future or plan for a more sustainable future, as well as items that are maybe coordination related. So leveraging this discussion to support non-development code improvements. So I think this one is probably one of the more challenging ones for us because there are a wide breadth of topics and certainly a lot of coordination that needs to take place as far as sustainability goes. So, so any comments, thoughts, items that we may have missed on sustainability? Very good, very good. So housing in neighborhoods is our next topic that we reviewed. So our plans promote a mix of housing opportunities, looking for improving the quality of the existing housing stock in the city, looking to enhance neighborhood design and identity, and considering the regional balance of jobs to housing so that we're reducing the overall vehicle miles traveled and congestion, as well as, again, promoting walkable, bikeable neighborhoods. Our current development code is set up with a variety of zone districts that do provide for some mix of housing, But I think the discussion that we had really highlighted a number of different things as far as making sure that the zone districts are providing the right amount of opportunities, and also encouraging diverse types of housing to be developed where appropriate. So as far as the discussion goes, the steering committee highlighted really making sure that we're open to more building types, and kind of reducing that idea that emphasis on density, and really paying more attention to the building scale and mass as it fits in with the overall neighborhood and context. Another item that we heard loud and clear was this idea of relaxing lot coverage standards in accommodations for building heights. So I think one of you said go wider and lower as far as one of the directions goes, to help buildings fit in with the neighborhood designs historically. Another item is looking at reduction of barriers and accommodate ADUs in more contexts. Also looking at emphasizing streetscapes as a unifying element of neighborhood design. So that idea that the streetscape can be that unifying character, as opposed to each individual house needing to have too many similar design features. And then finally, looking to address building design, including scale and mass standards, aesthetic and quality details, and elements of architectural style. So acknowledging the fact that there's a lot of different periods represented in the community, and really starting to open up a dialogue on these conversations to be able to identify an approach that really fits for various contexts within Inglewood. So some of the options that we'll consider and really facilitate is a building type approach. Again, reducing the sort of blunt tool approach of emphasizing just density, but really emphasizing the building scale and formats so that we can promote more small lot design, look at different opportunities for like row houses, and explore ranges for multi-dwelling types in a way that fits. And to the second bullet point, really looking at the nuances between your current residential districts and making sure that we're fitting the right types of housing into those districts so that there's logical transitions between each of those R1, 2, and 3, as well as the A, B, and C elements of those residential districts. Also looking at transitions between neighborhoods and mixed use and TOD centers and corridors, and then looking at options for style neutral design standards for neighborhoods, and really considering the overall geography. So a lot to digest there, and certainly neighborhoods and housing are going to be a big emphasis in moving forward. But any thoughts or items that maybe we missed or didn't quite characterize quite right?
Matt, this is Wade. Just real quick, does some of this, for those that might be watching this online or anything, this will take a look at our lot characteristics as well, such as lot coverage and heights and setbacks and bulk planes and all that, just to be clear.
Yeah, that's correct. So what we want to do is make sure that we are essentially right sizing all of those dimensional standards so that we are not inadvertently precluding different types of housing from being built. So much of the overall housing model depends on the economic viability of it. And so if you have standards that require too large a lot, you're automatically pushing towards a more expensive housing unit on that lot. So we really want to be careful that we're looking at those nuances of lot coverage, bulk, setbacks, to make sure that we are really creating a smart approach to residential development.
Very good. Thank you.
All right, so we're doing pretty good on time, and I do appreciate you bearing with me on that quick blitz of review of what we've talked about. Really, all of this is building towards our next steps, which include some public engagement opportunities. And I'm going to go ahead and dive into kind of the overall view of how we're thinking about approaching engaging with the public, and hopefully get some feedback from you all on what you think is going to be the most effective strategy to have that discussion. So our next steps will include really 3 distinct phases of public engagement. The first is a series of listening sessions, and the objective for these workshops is to make sure that we hear and understand key issues. Now, we've heard from the plan documents what folks have said in general at a high level. We've heard from you as the steering committee some more specific details on issues that you think we need to address, and maybe some direction that we could go. But ultimately, we want to check in with the broader public and make sure that we've identified key issues and also directions for exploration of solutions. So ultimately, with this step of the process, we want to make sure we find out the right answer for how do we go about exploring the answers and identifying the solutions. So a little bit more on that in the next slide as we dive into what these listening sessions might look like. After the listening sessions, we're really moving into an options exploration phase. And this objective would be to consider and review the options and really identify the preferred solutions of how we ultimately codify elements into our regulations. And so this step is a variety of different venues and strategies to be able to build understanding of issues, and then ultimately be ready to come out of this process with a recommendation of a specific strategy. And then finally, the third phase is route navigation, which is to review the recommendations and make sure we're finalizing a path forward. So formalizing that code direction as we move into drafting. So to dive in a little bit into the first workshops and that listening session stage, what we intend to do is to structure these as probably 2 workshops. The topics that we went through as a steering committee will likely be divided into 2 different sessions, just because that's a lot to handle in one meeting. And so we want to make sure that we've got enough time for people to really digest and learn about some of these issues and explore and explain their thoughts. So what we would do is we would start with a welcome presentation that includes an overview of the project and some of that plan background. So what do our plans and codes say, and some of that historic background. But what we'd like to do in step 2 is provide for one or more of the members of the steering committee to help us as consultants in introducing each of the topics. So, because this is being guided by you all as a steering committee, we'd like to invite you to help us in presenting your thoughts to the members of the public that attend these workshops. So kind of doing what we just went through as far as the highlights of the discussion that you've had over the last several months. So from there, once that topic introduction has been made, we would look to move into roundtable discussions where folks would have about 20 minutes at 3 or 4 different stations. We would look at having a scribe available to write down the discussion points. And ultimately, the goal would be to then report back from each of those stations what the discussion was really about and some of the big ideas that we would like to explore. And again, we would hope to have steering committee members involved at each of those stations, as well as providing a summary of the reporting back of what we heard from the community, so that it's a little bit more grassroots generated ideas and discussion. And then ultimately, at that point, we would look at having a broad group discussion with everybody that's in attendance to look at identifying steps to explore issues further. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next step and explore a couple of the items. And Judy, I do see your hand. I just want to go ahead and throw all this out on the table so you've got the information, and then I think we can back up. So we do anticipate at each station having a board that explains what the plans say, what the codes say, what the steering committee says, as well as having an activity on the implementation spectrum. So again, for each of the topics, are we looking for more of a collaborative general guidance approach, or are we looking for more of a proactive, very specific regulatory approach on that implementation spectrum? So this would be one of the activities that we facilitate at each station. And then ultimately, as part of the step 5 group discussion, what we want to do is look at identifying areas or questions or topics and how we could explore those further. So for instance, on, let's just say a parking strategy. If we've got good consensus and folks are pretty comfortable that, yep, let's look at, reducing parking maximums, and that sounds like a good idea. That might go in that first bucket of a consensus direction that we start moving forward with drafting code language and getting more specific on that. As an alternative, there might be ideas that need to be modeled, that we need to kind of explore working through some illustrations or directions to illustrate the possible results that might come out from a development code regulation or idea. Another option that some of these concepts could be routed towards is a tour concept. Maybe we build out a case study on some of the ideas, or present a virtual tour. So getting in and digging into those details and experiencing some neighborhoods might be an option. Some topics might require a focus group where more information is required, or specialized topics could be explored in greater detail. And then we also see some items that might require ongoing or future discussions. So things that really fit better under the building code might fall into this bucket, or things that are really larger than we can really handle in the UDC process. So that's kind of where we're going with this first series of meetings. And the idea is then that these 5 buckets are our second exploration phase, where we start to move in and explore the different topics. And that'll take place over several months, could take different types of approaches based on the items on the screen in front of you. So with that, I think we've got kind of the full direction of where we're headed and want to get your feedback on, does this sound like a good first step? And are we on the right track? So I do want to back up first, if we could, to Judy Brown, who I know had her hand up early on before I started rolling on. So.
And so a couple comments, and I'd like to hear from some of the other planning and zoning people that were a part of it. But I attended, this is in terms of handling the public information listening sessions. I think this is a great model. I was involved as a citizen in one of the first ADU sort of information town hall sessions. And then we did a session similar to this where there were stations. And a couple of things the first one we did on the ADUs, I really liked the way it was done. The stations were there, but there was a fairly lengthy written questionnaire, and people sat down and actually talked to their neighbors about what they thought. It was, and then people gathered that up. There was not a, sort of like group discussion. I don't know how valuable the input was from that survey since I just filled one out, right? But I spent a fair amount of time there and talked to several people. There were just big empty tables for everybody to sit at and talk about. The one where we did the more like the group discussion, I'm going to tell you, you better have a really, really, really strong person who's going to manage that. Because I promise you, there will be 1 or 2 people who will take over. And if you don't make sure that the focus is clear, you'll end up talking about, you'll want to talk about parking, and they're going to be way off on setbacks or bulk plane or whatever their one little. So just know, and that was my experience at the one where we did sort of what you're describing. It got a little bit out of control with some of the, people who tend to monopolize with their one idea. So that's just a personal view of handling that in the group. So if you're going to do it with a group discussion, you need somebody who's really gonna limit the amount of time people can talk and make sure they're staying on topic. And it can't be somebody from the city who needs to make sure everybody doesn't hate them.
Perfect. Great comments. I think in examining how we would approach this meeting, we wanted to be very careful that we weren't necessarily providing just an open house. We did hear some comments that folks like to hear what their neighbors do have to say. And I think what we've tried to do through this process that we've identified is give you the best of both worlds, to where you have the opportunity to have a little bit of small group one-on-one discussion, but you also have the ability to hear from a larger group. And so, yeah, thank you. Really good points on the managed facilitation.
Christine?
Yeah, just a short comment. At the beginning, when you're presenting what the current plans say and what the steering committee is saying, it might be also nice to mention what we heard from the community in the UDC assessment process. I wasn't involved in that, but I would think if I was a citizen, I would be kind of confused about, didn't we just do this? Didn't we already give input to the city about kind of what we want to see? So some recognition that we did hear them and take that input into account to get us to this point.
Very good. Thank you.
Kate Townley?
Thanks. Yeah, I would say to follow up on what Judy was saying about the ADU open house and the stations and things like that, having kind of that survey or sort of it helps kind of people think through as they were going through stations. Maybe now we could have it so people can fill it out online so you can collect the data a lot easier. But I think it's also nice to have some of those paper copies just to facilitate between people who are there, just discussion. Because yeah, I think we ended up having really rich discussion with people and great opportunity for feedback. I had one other comment or question, and I was just wondering if there's any opportunity either when there's an overview of this or maybe for the part where you're talking about like modeling different elements, just thinking about not just like the physical impacts of changing the land use code in terms of what that can mean for height or bulk plane or things like that, but also the fiscal impacts. And I think the city had the great presentation from Joe Minicozy, but just really that these decisions do have a fiscal impact. And, you know, I know there's a desire for some community members to only continue to have single story housing. And that has a fiscal impact. So what are some of those other things besides just how something may look or someone's initial reaction to something, like the bottom line and the ability to, you know, remain, is it fiscally solvent or however, as a city? I think those are important factors and sometimes things that community members aren't, you know, we don't always have the tools in order to be able to make decisions, or we don't have that data to make decisions. So it'd be great if there's a way to include some of that at some point. Perfect.
Excellent. Thank you.
And Bernie?
Yeah, real quick. Everybody, great comments. And I'm not sure if this was planned or not, but it would be nice, I think, before you have the individual listening sessions to have a general overview. And I think these meetings tend to go better when there are some photo documentation, examples, drawings, case studies to show as part of the discussion. So if there's, and to broaden it beyond just development. In other words, if we're talking about something like relaxing some lot coverage requirements, maybe have an example of how that impacts a remodel or an addition on a house, you know, in two different types of lot conditions or zoning conditions, things that I think will allow people to personalize it a little bit, but also put a visualization to something, because it helps to soften the aspect of change. I find when they can see what these trade-offs are and what some of the things that we are promoting. I think it's good for people to see this because they're not necessarily as dialed into some of the trends and some of the things that are going on in the construction and development world.
Very good. Thank you.
So Matt, we're almost to time. Do you have a wrap up that you'd like or any homework you're going to assign for the first of the year, or?
Not at this point. I think we really just wanted to make sure that this, you know, overall engagement approach was on the right track. I think we've got quite a bit of work ahead of us to start to build out this material in preparation for these workshops. And ultimately, you know, moving forward, I think we do see opportunities for specific discussions and scheduled updates with the steering committee. You know, as we prep for the outreach, we want to come back to you with more of that detailed information. Again, just to use you as a sounding board to make sure that we've got it right. And then kind of after this first listening session series of workshops, we see working with you all on, you know, the modeling, the tour and case study components, probably as a focus group as well, to identify those items that we need to dig into and get more specific feedback from you all on. So that's kind of the direction that we're headed. And ultimately, really appreciate the feedback and certainly would welcome if you do have thoughts after this meeting. I know we're a little bit limited on time, please do route those through Wade to provide us with additional refinements to this process as we move forward.
Thank you, everyone. Have a very nice holiday. Thank you, Matt. And for my planning commission members, you'll exit this meeting and join the public hearing on the other link. So everyone have a great holiday. Matt, you were going to say something?
I just wanted to thank you all. Have a great holiday, and we'll see you next year.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.